So first up, we've got Professor Stephen Joseph from Smart Mobility Research Unit at the University of Hertfordshire. Professor Joseph, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Richard. Next slide, please. Yes, just so I'll, bearing in mind time, I'll try and keep this brief. This is just an introductory slide
Don't feel
about.
compelled to be brief. We need
Okay.
detail from you.
Okay, fine. All right. Okay. This is just an introduction to the university and the unit. We've done quite a lot of work in this area, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're part of other teams. We run a master's in transport planning. That's new, and we do research as well. Just the thing that people might like to note is the university runs its own bus company, Uno, which has over 100 buses. It's just taken delivery of its first electric buses. So it does walk the walk, as well as talking about transport. In fact, it's been expanding the bus company because of the growth of international students living outside the campus. Next slide, please. Well, Richard has already said some of this, but the reason we've got into this is because as a unit, we've focused on rural and peri-urban areas, because most transport research and policy we found actually focuses on cities. They do, but we think that for the reasons Richard has said, rural and peri-urban areas need attention. So if you take counties like Hertfordshire, or indeed Warwickshire, or indeed North Somerset, actually, on the edge of cities, they generally are prosperous. They have car ownership. They've got severe traffic congestion. Some of them have no large cities, but several smaller towns in the way that Richard said. Others, like Oxfordshire and Norfolk, have one large city in the area. Some of them are on the edge of city regions. A lot of them have poor public transport. And actually, when you go to edge of city regions, you find you've got good radial but poor orbital public transport. And a lot of them have substantial planned house building, and I'll come back to that. So we've been running round tables since 2020 to develop a kind of research and policy agenda for these places. And we're now running more with Transport East, which some of you will know as the subnational transport body for the East of England, but it's the lead subnational transport body on rural transport. It runs a rural networking partnership, and I put there the links to that and to our roundtable research. Next slide, please. This is a why rural transport matters. I don't need to give this in detail, but a stat on carbon. Somebody at one of our early roundtables found that if you take urban districts classified as urban-rural, urban/rural outside conurbations, they're 60% of the English population, 72% of transport carbon. Shire counties' transport carbon emissions per head double those in London, 2/3 higher than metropolitan districts. So this does matter. And there's alongside this, we were talking about co-benefits earlier, there's social exclusion, and this is a big issue in rural areas. I don't need to tell anybody on the call this. Transport for the North did some very useful evidence gathering and research on this, and found that 21% of people in the north of England are at risk of what are called transport-related social exclusion. There's some those are numbers about access, proportions who couldn't get to basic services, health, education, and employment. So just to say that there is some evidence out there that's quite useful. Next slide, please. So what have we found from the round tables? Well, these are some headings. I think we could spend a lot of time on kind of generalities, but what we found is some good examples, saying that it's possible to have better rural public transport, that active travel can be a real option for travel outside cities, that there's new technology which can bring new travel options. I think we're going to hear about some of that later. And that new housing doesn't have to be car-based. Those pictures there are of, I think, Cornwall at the top right, Poundbury on the left in Dorset, a housing development called New Loversthorpe in Leicestershire, which has had a bus service since day one, and a commuter census done by Mobility Ways on journeys to work. And I'll come back to those later. Next slide, please. So what are the findings? Well, the practical ways forward. There are what we found, and the roundtables have been networking these really, are initiatives and projects that are reducing single car use and diesel vans in rural areas. I just mentioned the travel mobility ways. So Mobility Ways, which is an offshoot of Lift Share, have been doing travel plans for commuting to rural workplaces. And for example, they've just done a pilot project in the hospital in King's Lynn by getting data on where employees at that hospital are coming from, as a result of which there are going to be new bus routes and community transport links, which are expected to run with very little subsidy, because the evidence that Mobility Ways has gathered has shown exactly how to route those bus services so as to fill them up. So that's the first thing about travel plans for commuting. Just on carbon and commuting for a moment. One of the things about carbon and travel is that actually a lot of the carbon is in the journeys of 10 to 25 miles, and commuting in rural areas is a good chunk of that. So actually doing those travel plans at large workplaces in rural areas, it does target carbon well. Um, the other thing is, the previous slide, please. The other thing is that bike hire and cargo bikes are spreading out of cities to smaller towns and rural counties. I put a link to Beryl, which is one of the providers of that, which has got bike hire up and running in places like Cornwall and Dorset, and Cargodale, which is running a bike hire scheme in Calderdale in the Pennines. And we're also now seeing car clubs and car sharing in rural areas and edge of cities. There's a key point to make. We ran one of our roundtables yesterday on public-private partnerships on rural transport, and one of the things we discovered, there's quite a lot of private sector initiatives going on which have limited or no council involvement. They're just getting on with it. I'll mention one or two in a minute. Next slide, please. Yeah, so public transport. I noticed that there's head of transport strategy from Cornwall on the call. We've been looking at what Cornwall have been doing. They did start with some money, but some of the things they've done on creating good interchanges, on creating tap on, tap off ticketing and integrated timetables are things that are replicable elsewhere. I know that Peninsula Transport, the Southwest subnational transport body, is looking at ways of rolling out the Cornwall experience to the rest of the Southwest. Demand responsive transport, I think we might be going to hear about this shortly. We found a lot of debate about this because there's a concern that actually it's not clear to users what they are, that they're difficult to book, but we have found clear cases for DRT. That map at the bottom is an accessibility map in North Hertfordshire, which has now got Herts links. And on the left are the accessibility points, places people could get to on foot with a bus service before the DRT, and on the right is after the DRT. So you can see that putting in a DRT service in North Hertfordshire has massively improved accessibility for people. 25% of the users of that service were people who used to drive to stations to commute into London, and another 25% are 16 to 18-year-olds who used to be driven by their parents to the college at Buntingford and now use the demand responsive bus. And there are different providers, and I put some links in there. Ride Tandem are and Zelo are interesting operators, because what they do is act as mediators between employers and transport providers to provide coach services, for example, to bring many, in cases, blue collar, but now increasingly white collar employees into workplaces. And Ride Tandem say that their average load on their buses is 33. So you can see how that will make a difference in terms of vehicle occupancy. And there are software providers like Padam who are providing the North Herts Links service. Next slide, please. Tourism has been a big feature. We've run a couple of roundtables on this. Leisure travel accounts for the most mileage in the UK, and most of it's by car, and there are some initiatives. There are new organisations promoting car-free tourism, such as Good Journey and the Eco Attractions Group. Snowdonia Iwitha has now put in the summer months pre-booked parking, park and ride Sherpa shuttle buses, traffic restrictions for those without parking. In other words, if you park on the roads in the national park, you will get towed away in July and August. And there are some local initiatives like sustainable, like Cumbria Ullswater Valley Group that is running and funding its own bus services to reduce pressures on rural roads in the Lake District in the summer. And there's international good practice on sustainable tourism and travel. Lowcarbondestinations.org, Alistair Kirkbride is doing this, though he points out that fragmented governance in places like National Park does make action on transport difficult. Next slide, please. And there are other options, mobility hubs, which are being talked about a lot, which bring transport together in rural areas with bike hire, car clubs, sometimes scooter hire where they're legal, public transport. And England's Economic Heartland, another of the subnational bodies, has done a business case work with KPMG on how to justify these. And there's a group called Como UK, which have done a lot on this. Spatial planning, I won't go on about this because we've already talked about the planning bill, but the issue in rural areas is that where you build homes and the layout and design will have an impact on travel, and there are opportunities there. The links I put in there are for Transport for New Homes, which is just done in a report on this. Create Streets, Richard will know about their work in Chippenham, which suggested that you could have more housing with less traffic. And E-Rail is a group that's recently helped Northumberland County Council fund railway stations on their reopened Northumberland line by land value capture, not with developers, but with landowners. And they're talking to others about how you might make that work. And there are also community initiatives, community transport, car clubs, local area projects, business groupings, and they're under the radar in some places. Next slide, please. So ways forward. What we found, I will finish in a minute. The roundtables have found many projects that are providing better rural transport, and these need to be better known. There are opportunities for private sector investment in rural transport, mobility hubs, and for pooling funding and services. And I would say that the government bus reforms may be an opportunity to support more integrated transport networks in rural areas. And one of the things we've been looking at is what franchising might mean, and it might not mean what London and Manchester have done. It might mean micro-franchising, it might mean profit sharing, it might mean actually the government has allowed for this. You could take your existing tendered network and turn it into a franchise with direct awards. And you could do micro-franchising. So like the Ullswater Valley, you could do something, a franchise in a particular area, maybe paid for by, in that case, visitor levies or visitor parking fees. So I think from our soundings, the Department for Transport buses people are interested in pilots and templates on what franchising might look like, different forms of franchising might look like outside cities. And so I think there's a discussion to be had about that. Next slide, please. And final slide, basically, without lots of cash, there are rural transport options. We found a lot of people doing interesting things. I think there are opportunities for joining up and making better use of existing local transport. New approaches to rural mobility need to be inclusive, and we've done a roundtable on that. And basically, I think our summary is that it is possible to cut vehicle mileage and give places outside cities good alternatives to some of the private car use going on there, and that universal SUVs are not the only option. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. We'll come to questions in a bit. So I'm going to run through our other two speakers, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. Next up, we've got Pooya Kamvari, who's the founder and CEO of HomeRun.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Stephen, for that really interesting presentation as well just now. Yes, if we go to the next slide, please, Cecily. What we're looking at reducing school travel impact, and I have a background myself in engineering, law, and investment banking. So why did I foolishly decide to do this? Well, it's because I wanted to do something with a social and environmental benefit, and also because I live in two areas, or I've lived in two areas in the UK, one in Northwest London, one in Cambridge, and both times I noticed the impact of the school run personally. We've all probably seen it, half term, how much better life feels with those roads being clearer. And when we researched it, we actually found that 51% of peak time rush hour journeys in the morning are to educational establishments. So the school run is the biggest single traffic generator in that 8 to 9 a.m. peak. Um, I think my background experience probably led me to approach this problem in a different way than a lot of people in the sector. And when we researched it, what we found, or what I felt, is that the real issue here is a lack of data. So a lot of decisions being made without understanding of the problems that are trying to be solved in that place-based specific manner. Um, from my background, the industries I worked in, if you can't measure something, then you really can't improve it either. So when we founded HomeRun, and we were very much emphasizing on technologies that collected that behavior, that transport data, but also data on behaviors, why people are making certain choices and how that affects solutions in the future. And what we do, we work with local authorities such as Wiltshire, Essex, and about 150 schools at the moment, including state schools, academies, independent schools. And we offer whatever alternatives there are, but with a focus on journey sharing and car sharing, which we find in rural areas in particular, there's a high demand for. Importantly, as I mentioned, we've been able to collect all this data and make a very big breakthrough for the sector, which I'll come on to in a bit. So if we move to the next slide. So first of all, let's discuss the key factors that generate school run traffic and emissions. Probably won't surprise anyone, but these are journey distances and times, realistic alternatives to driving with an emphasis on realistic. It is your constituents who must believe they're realistic. That's the key. And pupil age. Now, there are other factors like cost per household, culture, income levels, but looking at these three key factors, it's clear that rural settings will make driving more prevalent than metropolitan and urban areas. If we move on. So just to make that clear, let's have a look at two maps, same zoom level. So you are comparing like for like. On the left is a urban metropolitan primary school. You can see there the green dots are pupils walking to school, the orange are people driving, and the yellow is carpooling. Now, these are two schools we've worked with, which is why we've got this data. So on the left, you can see a very tight catchment, almost everyone walking to school, and then some pupils on the outskirts being driven. So what did we manage to do? We got a few people carpooling. You can see those yellows, but also we got people kind of walking along with people who are driving as well. So now I think within that context, you can see why it's quite clear why things like school streets, closing the road, making it more convenient for people to walk who are already doing so, and a kind of almost exclusive focus on active travel makes sense. But if we look at the right-hand side, which is a rural school community in Buckinghamshire, very different story. You can see the catchment is much wider. There are plenty of people. Sorry, can everyone see the slides? I can see messages going up, but are the slides moving?
They're certainly moving for me, clearly not for
Okay.
everyone. But
Okay.
I think they're displaying at too large a level,
Ye-
too large a size. Bits of it are falling off the screen for me.
Okay. I will carry on and hope that everyone can see what I'm talking about. So yeah, on the right-hand side is the more rural setting. You can see much wider, almost no one within that walking distance. We know cycling just doesn't happen for primary schools in rural settings currently. So what can we do? And you can see carpooling, which are those yellow dots where we're saving carbon. And also we're working with that school on a park and stride solution. So you can see very, very different solutions for both. If we go to the next slide, please. So let's look at what hasn't worked as a precursor for what hopefully will work. So one-size-fits-all solutions created with urban settings in mind just haven't worked. Not just for rural schools, actually for many schools. I think we've shown why with the examples we just looked at. An over-dependence on exclusively promoting walking and cycling, we think is just too narrow a focus. Yes, understanding walking and cycling as parts of the journey, but if you're looking exclusively, you're going to focus only on metropolitan and kind of short journeys. And rural areas have been left behind. So currently we're seeing some of the lowest levels of walking to school in rural areas for the last 20 years. And finally, solutions that are labor intensive for schools. Schools do not have the time or resource to focus on travel. We must make sure these solutions are tech enabled and easy and serviced for the schools, not giving them lots of things to fill in and expect that they will do so. Next slide, please. And how do we know they haven't worked? Well, this is from the National Travel Survey, and I've split out rural areas. So what you can see here is over the last 20 years, the pink, which is driving, has gone up from 37% to 49%, and these are journeys to school. The buses have dropped, so maybe that shouldn't be a surprise, and walking has dropped as well. So whatever's been happening the last 20 years, I think it's pretty clear to say that it hasn't been working, and we probably shouldn't just be repeating more of the same. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do? Well, we need data-led, targeted, hyperlocal interventions that provide value for money and sustainable outcomes. But the problem is that 95% of schools do not have up-to-date and actionable travel data. So we know we need this, this information, but how are we going to get it? Well, we have come up with a solution. Two things have gone in our favor. One is, as I mentioned, all that data we've collected. So we have about 100,000 UK school journeys where we really understand at a deep level what's going on there. And secondly, we have the advancements in technology. So in particular, machine learning and AI, which is enabling us to look at new, exciting ways of doing things. So we took all of those learnings, put it into a Innovate UK bid, and we were successful to get DFT funding or part funding for the solution, which we've developed, which, Cecily, if we move on one more slide, that is called HomeRun Step AI. So what we've developed is a school run AI. What that does is that takes all that data that we had, we've combined it with about 50 data sets, including things like income levels, cost per household. And that means that we can now predict accurately the travel modes being used today, but also what travel modes can be used, what are realistic for the future and to be more sustainable. So looking at that map on the left, just to give an example, you can see what we have there is the pupil age, the home address, the school address. And what we do is we model every single option to school that pupil has. Now, for car journeys, we're looking at, replicating peak time traffic conditions. For bus journeys, we're looking at reliability. We're looking at, does that bus journey even get to school on time? For walking and cycling, we're looking at the routes and calculating topography. So we're finding if there's any steep hills along the way, or again, any other things, pavement provisions, all things that impact people's ability to take these choices. And that means that for every journey, we get a probability of what is likely happening today, but also what's realistic. So we separate people who drive, who do so because they have no alternative, and those people should not be punished, from other people who drive who can do something, and how do we nudge them to those more sustainable modes? Well, so what the three key benefits, what we're finding out is by taking this targeted approach, you can create 10 times more value for money using existing budgets, which we'll come on to in a sec to how that is. Secondly, by having this kind of modeling, you can help mitigate the impacts of accelerating home building targets. And finally, reducing health inequalities by targeting need, not kind of engagement. So almost done now. Next slide. So yeah, we talked about that 10 times. So this project, we're doing a proof of concept across the whole of Essex. So we're modeling 550 schools and around 230,000 journeys. Wiltshire are next, so we're gonna do the same thing for Wiltshire very soon. And just a quick case study on Tendring, which is a very rural area of Essex. What you can see on the right, what you can see on the right is the 46 schools in Tendring sorted by their realistic ability to reduce CO2 on the school run. Now, what we found is that top 90th percentile, that top 10%, so much of the impact is coming there. So rather than diluting our spending across 45 schools in Tendring and trying to do travel planning for everyone and all these things, what we're finding you should do is focus your resources where the opportunity is. And by doing that, you would get 10 times the impact of CO2 reduction than the average school in Tendring. And if we can move on to the final slide. So just to end on some recommendations. So number one, as I think Richard also mentioned, it's very, very clear that we need rural specific transport policies and funding. The examples I gave with the urban and rural school, the urban school can get central funding for active travel from Active Travel England. The rural authority cannot get funding for car sharing. They would have to fund it from their own internal budgets, and that clearly isn't right. Secondly, is to focus resources on high value for money initiatives. I think in the current economic context that we find ourselves, it's very important that any spending in this space can be justified, is impactful, because that is going to make the case for future investment. So again, having that strategic intelligence, making sure that we shouldn't focus on the miles of bike lanes, we should focus on who's going to use those bike lanes and whether we can really show value for money. Because if we can't, we may find in 4 years' time, a lot of good work is ripped away. And finally, embrace disruptive innovation and new ideas. I don't think it's controversial now to say that we won't hit net zero by our targets with the current systems in place. With the current systems and thinking in place, it's not going to happen. Let's not pretend it is. And, we need to address those barriers of why in the public sector, we can't maybe make those braver decisions to go for some more high-tech and innovative ideas. And yeah, that's the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. There is nothing like a bit of evidence-led policy making, is there? Gosh. Right, if I then come on to Annemieke Waite, who's from North Somerset, who's now going to give us a rundown on the Winford Pioneer.
Thank you. I'm so excited about the two talks we've just heard, because I've got so many things I want to ask and that I'm going to take away, because so many ideas. Really excellent. Thank you. So hello everyone. My name is Annemieke Waite, and I'm, as it says there, the exec member for Climate Waste and Sustainability, North Somerset Council. More importantly, I am also the ward member for the Winford ward, which is a very rural ward in North Somerset. And when I say very rural, it sits right on the edge of Bristol, as you'll see from my next slide. Cecily, please. Thank you. Okay, this is the whole of North Somerset. To the right, you will see the bit where I rudely say Bristolians live here and here. And it just shows you where the connections are failing. So my ward is the really big one at the top right-hand bottom, highlighted by the pink line. From my top window, I can see Bristol. It's about half a mile away, but I sit at the top of the hill, and so do all the other villages near here, and there are no footpaths. There is no easy way to get to the city, and yet some of us are only a mile or 2 miles away from the city, and there is no public transport, and there hasn't been any for a very long time. So when I was campaigning in 2023, because I've only been a councillor since then, when I was campaigning to become a councillor, what residents told me more than anything was how isolated they felt, and the fact that we haven't had any bus services here for years and years and years. And it has a huge impact on the community. I've listed some of them for you there on the screen. It's really difficult. Parents are struggling to get their kids to school. People can't do the commuting run. And in particular, the elderly feel extremely isolated. What's also part of my thinking is that 45% of North Somerset councils, or the entire district of North Somerset, 45% of our carbon footprint is down to transport. And that's a really, really tricky one for us to deal with. And when you think about the fact that the majority of North Somerset is rural, we were talking earlier about how can you get value for money, but I'm also looking at it in terms of decarbonisation. Where are you going to get the best mileage for your decarbonisation? Is it when you're going to get people to walk half a mile, or is it actually getting people who live in rural communities out of their cars and having a more sustainable version of transport for them? So all of these things were things that were on my mind. I spent my first year as a councillor walking up and down the hills of Dundry, where I live, just having long discussions with my husband about how we really needed to have a bus service in our ward, and he laughed. And the length of my discussions are usually based on how many fields it takes me to move on to the next topic. This was definitely a 5 fields topic, and it was a recurrent topic. And then the first attempt at finding a solution from the West of England Combined Authority which sort of helps us with the public transport issues, because we're allowed to be part of it for transport. They came up with the Westlink. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. Yes. So we were all offered Westlink demand responsive public transport options. Now, they've been rolled out all over the country, lots of different areas. They all use a different kind of software. Not everyone has exactly the same way of calculating how these things are done. And for whatever reason, in our area, it hasn't really worked. I loved hearing earlier that it's really effective in other parts, but here it just hasn't really worked. The problem is that our district is divided up into lots of different zones. You're not allowed to go from one zone to the other zone. And then, you know, it inevitably meant that some of the journeys were extremely long, where people had to sit on a bus for an hour for what should have been a 15-minute journey. They didn't want to use it anymore. And then we had cancelled services. So there was a huge amount of frustration. More Fifields discussions on my part as we were doing the dog walking. And then a new opportunity arose. And thank you. You knew it was coming, didn't you, Cecily? The West of England Combined Authority announced they were going to have what they called West Local Services, where communities could design their own bus services. And I took that as a golden opportunity, and I decided I was going to make sure we were going to apply for one of those. So I decided that I just worked out what I thought would be a useful route, and I set up a survey. I learned how to do SurveyMonkey. I was very proud of myself, and managed to get more than 200 responses from the different villages that were potentially going to be on the route for our new bus service. So I asked them lots of questions, because I've felt it was really important for this to be a bottom-up approach. I wanted to know what our residents really needed, rather than what we thought they wanted. So my questions were all about, where do you want to go? What are your favorite starting points? What are your favorite stops along the route? What times of the day would you need to travel? What are the purposes of your journeys into Bristol? And all that information came back, and then led me to having a huge amount of data with which to work. And I have the next slide, please, Cecily. So then I got to the point for making it happen. With all the results that I had and the information that people provided me with, my next step was to come up with a plan and to set up a partnership. Clearly, the funding was going to come from the West of England Combined Authority, with funding also from North Somerset Council if we were lucky enough to win the bid. But I still needed to have a bus service, a bus company that was going to fit with what I wanted to do. And I needed, more importantly, to have a community interest company to put the bid in, because as a councillor, I'm not allowed to bid for this kind of funding. So it was a very sneaky arrangement. I wrote the entire bid. I found the West of England Rural Network, which perfectly fitted with what it is I was trying to do. You can see on the screen what their ethos is and what their values are. Working with rural communities was right up my street. And the Big Lemon, the bus company, had moved from Brighton to Bristol, and they were absolutely perfect for what it was I wanted to do. Wearing my Green Party hat, I felt that it would have to be a company that was, you know, looking at sustainable transport options and zero emissions vehicles in the long run. So luckily for me, they both agreed that they wanted to be partners, and so the bid was submitted, and then the result came in. There we are. And this is our new bus route that has now been running since the 2nd of September. It's a service that provides commuter routes in and out of Bristol. It then has additional services into Bristol for people who want to go shopping. We managed to combine the routes in such a way that they pick up on the different shopping centres that were particularly popular. It stops at hospitals. It does 2 train stations and 1 bus interchange hub. And in addition, it is managing to collect children from a secondary school in Backwell in the afternoon, which means that those children now do not need to be collected by their parents. And on top of that, the bus company was given permission to have reasonable flexibility in picking up, so that if we have people with access issues in those rural communities within as you can see on the screen, the pink zones where the villages are. Within those pink zones, the bus is allowed to slightly deviate from the route, so people can, in theory, be collected from their home. There's an onboard tracker, so people can follow the bus on their smartphones. They can see exactly where it is so that they can time how long they want to stay at the bus stop for. And it's now been up and running since September. Right, so the impact of that has been enormous. I've just had the most amazing feedback. I've done a feedback survey from all the residents, and this is just one of about 40 individual comments that I've had back from residents where they've, just been glowing about it. It's really been fascinating to hear how many elderly residents who haven't actually individually and independently left their villages for sometimes years have now felt able to get on the bus and to go to Bristol for a couple of hours and to, come home again without having to ask someone else for a lift. Parents who've said that, they can now go back to work because if they don't have to be at the secondary school in the afternoon to pick up their children, it means once they dropped off at school in the morning, they have the whole day to go back to work. So it's had a hugely positive impact. And yeah, I can't lie. I'm really very proud. So what next? There we are. West Local is called People Powered Transport, and in the short term, what we have to do is to continue to grow our passenger numbers quite clearly. Our funding is only eligible for 18 months, so it's a grant that we have for 18 months. We have to show that our service is viable, and yes, on top of that, I think we have a lot of plans. So we have made some tiny tweaks to the timetable. In the medium term, we certainly want to expand the services. I am writing another bid for funding. We would like to include Saturday services while we still can, and because I think that is also a really important issue, because young people in rural communities are really, really struggling because they can't even have a Saturday job somewhere without their parents having to drop them off for work somewhere. So we're preparing a bid for that, which will go in May. And in the long term, yes, it's back to that viability and increasing the people using the bus. And yes, I could talk about it for much, much longer, but I think my time is up. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, it sounds excellent stuff. We just come back to this sustainability word, which I think really is going to be the crux of pretty much everything from a rural context. Anyway,